The words we live by. The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated independent stations present The Words We Live By, the summer series of the Eternal Light program, which comes to you under the auspices of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Today we present the 12th in this series of 15 literary dialogues on democracy and the Bible, featuring two of America's foremost men of letters, Maurice Samuel and Mark Van Doren.
Maurice, today, in continuation of our talks about democracy and the Bible, we have proposed to one another to go on beyond the point where we left ourselves last week when we were discussing the conduct of individuals toward one another, and of course that is of the deepest importance, to go on beyond that into a consideration of social organization itself, the forms of society, including maybe first of all and last of all government. But perhaps you were not satisfied last week. Perhaps there are things left over in your mind. It rather looks to me as I study you.
I was bursting with a number of things to say.
Well, go ahead.
And suddenly is it atropos, the one that comes with the cursed shears and
yes,
and cuts the thin spun thread.
Yes.
There were things that were on my mind. The phrase I wanted to get out, it's a phrase really, and that is morality as conditioned reflex.
Yes.
The conditioned reflex. There's so much study of conditioned reflex now, and there's so much Pavlovian thought going around, that people have begun to think of morality as being an extension of the study of the dog, the tongue of which salivates at the sound of a bell when no food is going to be given to it. You know, you're supposed to do good without any reward. And you remember Pavlov's experiment that they had a dog, gave it food and rang a bell at the same time. Afterwards, without giving it the food, the ringing of the bell made it salivate.
Yes.
So people think of morality as an extension of this conditioned reflex. You're not going to get a reward, but you're going to do the good action because you have been so conditioned and not because you have so thought it out. All the dodges that there are nowadays for getting at the mind without thinking.
Yes.
How to instill thoughts without going through the painful process of acquiring them, as in subliminal advertising, so-called, or getting you to learn while you're asleep. Into your cushion there will be wired lessons, and the murmuring sound will soothe you into a state of beatitude, and you won't know why. You'll wake up in the morning and you will be a good person. This is what I find not merely ludicrous, but gruesome.
Yes, well, I agree with you that there's no more disturbing word to me than conditioning. We sometimes speak as if all we had to do to get a certain social result is to condition the people, or condition a generation of the people, maybe the young ones, maybe the old ones, to behave certain ways, not to think certain ways, but to behave certain ways.
Makes me think of smoking a carcass.
Yes, we even debase the word education to mean what conditioning might mean. I've always remembered a man who told me some years ago that he was present at a conference where some businessmen were considering how they should best put an idea over on the world. And one of them said, well, who's going to educate Congress? Who's going to
educate Congress?
That is to say,
and
who's going
you used, with intent, of course, the sarcastic phrase, put an idea over on the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's no idea, there's no notion at all that the world should be properly convinced of the truth of the idea. It was merely that it was hoped that somehow or other people, hardly knowing what was happening to them, would begin to believe certain things. What about the phrase that is current these days, the human condition? Does that trouble you at all? I hear it everywhere.
It troubles me in this sense that, first of all, it is a distortion of language. When a man says he has a heart condition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, everybody has a heart condition.
Yeah.
He wants to say the condition of his heart is causing him some concern.
Yes.
But he has a heart condition.
But of course, he might have a good condition.
Yes. Or a man says he's going abroad to study conditions.
Yes.
Which is a little more tolerable. But he's going abroad to study the state of the the finances of a country or the governmental situation is going to condition. Now, the human condition has, for me, the same flabbiness of form. If it's used in a particular stern context, that the human condition is such and such in relation to a given point, I understand it.
Well,
but the phrase itself offends me.
Yes, it does to me. In the deepest sense, it might mean a great deal. The human condition is the condition of being made in the image of God, and yet not being God.
But now you're giving it a context.
And yet not being
God. If you give it a context, the phrase can have dignity.
You see, that is the human predicament. In its finest form, it seems to me. We are lower than the angels, we are lower than God, and we are higher than animals. What are we? Where are we? What are we, and where are we? Suspended, as it were, between those two extremes. Now, that is I think that's a profound way of understanding our obligations to ourselves. In a sense, we shall never understand perfectly what we should do, even though we have been told. We all know that we backslide, we forget, and all that sort of thing. That is to say, it is difficult for men to be men.
This leads, Mark, back to what we should be making the main subject of this talk. Can government help people to be moral? Is government intended for that purpose, or is government a neutral arrangement within which people must develop their own morality? Is there supposed to be in government a forward push toward consideration and affection, love of thy neighbor, that sort of thing? There is a very deep problem there when one attempts to divorce the biblical concept of human relations from the mechanics of government as government theorists have evolved it. There is a deep problem there that I think we ought to touch on in connection with government forms as they appeared in the Bible.
Yes, you're right. We have tended to fall into a way of thinking which suggests that there is a political man just as there is an economic man. He is a counter. Men are counters which are shuffled about in certain new relationships which one hopes will be better relationships than previous ones. But there's almost never any suggestion, I think, that the government itself is a teacher.
Yes, now that is an idea that leads right into our discussion. The very first form of government that appears in the Bible precedes the giving of the Ten Commandments, you remember, that in that very fateful and exciting, very crowded period of a few months between the Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the law at Sinai, a tremendous constitutional change was made in Jewish life. You remember Moses met his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and Jethro observed how Moses sat all day long giving advice to people, adjudicating causes, and he said, "But you're going to wear yourself out. This is impossible." And he suggested to him that he take a certain form, that he appoint captains of thousands, captains of hundreds, and captains of tens. Choose wise men. Mm-hmm. And the word that's used there, meaning wise men, isn't just legalistic minds. It means men of insight. Let them help the people. Let them teach the people. The law hadn't been given yet formally. There was the Sabbath and there was the Passover, but the law, the Ten Commandments, had been given, and what we call the Book of the Covenant, the 7 or 8 chapters, is it, following the Ten Commandments, in which all of these laws, these very beautiful laws you read out last week, are contained, hadn't been given yet. Nevertheless, they were there to teach people more than to adjudicate causes. This was the first government form that we have, at least in the chronology of the Bible. And then later on in the book of Numbers, there came the famous incident when the Jews began, not for the first time rather, they began again to grumble and to quarrel and to why were we brought out of Egypt, where we ate garlic and leeks and fish, and we had all we wanted, and then a quail was sent. And Moses turned to God with that heart-rending plea, said, I can't carry these people anymore. He said, did I beget these people that I must carry them as a father bears his nursing child? And then we had another form of government instituted, and that was of 70 elders.
Yes.
Now, there's another form of government, but again it was based on the choice of the men. This was not you vote and you elect. It was the wise men as appointed by Moses, men who had prophecy in them. The Spirit of God came on them at the moment, we're told in the story of the book of Numbers. And as a matter of fact, when the Spirit had left them, presumably with a residuum, a permanent residuum, two of the elders carried on prophesying, ran through the camp prophesying, Eldad and Medad. Somebody came to Moses, I think it was Joshua, and said, look, Eldad and Medad are running through the camp prophesying. And Moses said, would that all the children of Israel would prophesy. Now, there you have two early forms of government.
Well, now, and there's no suggestion at any time, I'm sure, that the government as teacher had in view what certain governments of our time have had, namely the objective of conditioning the people into certain ways of thinking. The most outrageous example of this in our experience, I suppose, has been what happened to education in Germany during the Nazi period, when youth was educated not with a view to understanding something transcendent, something truly original in its truth, but with a view to their accepting conditions that the state...
Conditioning is the correct word. Everything enters into it, particularly again, and this haunts me, the question of following the mob to do evil. We have no tradition that I can remember offhand in the Bible of oratory. We have wisdom, but there was no Demosthenes among the Israelites, among ancient Israel, to sway the people by oratory. There was no Cicero doing what he did in the Senate. You remember the time of the Catiline conspiracy, where he so moved the Senate that they shrank away from the Catilinarian group.
Well, you remind me, Maurice, that Moses himself was a stammerer,
yes.
Not a very good talker.
Yes,
and by the way, that relates to Demosthenes, who himself had an impediment, which he learned to control, by going to the beach and putting pebbles in his mouth and learning how to speak clearly, even with them in his mouth.
But more than speak, he learned to sway an assembly.
Exactly, whereas Moses was not expected to do such a thing. Aaron, however, was a good speaker.
Well,
and Aaron spoke for him.
Well, you remember the distinction that's made between genius and talent.
Yes.
Moses was the genius, and Aaron had the talent.
But don't you think it is a very important thing to remind ourselves of, namely that the function of the government or the governing body, the judges, the good men, the wise men, or whatnot, was not to teach the people things that would benefit the state itself as an abstraction. It was to teach them things that would benefit themselves because they were true.
Now, this is the problem against which the Jews ran up frequently. They were not satisfied with government. They never instituted a good government because they were hankering after forms that didn't belong to them. They went through a period of chaos in the time of the judges, when we are told that there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was good in his own eyes. And then Samuel...
And that is anarchy, of course.
Yeah, anarchy. And then Samuel, there were the judges who arose. There arose a judge in Israel. Wasn't elected simply by the force of his personality, his ability. He became the leading figure. Then he disappeared. Then Samuel came, and he was a fusion of judge and prophet and teacher. And then the people, you remember, demanded a king.
Yes.
And you remember the attitude which was taken by the prophet himself and by that marvelous passage. I wish you'd read it. That marvelous passage where Samuel. And before you do it, though, Mark, let me make an observation. It's a fantastic thing how people will persist on reading into the Bible implications and consequences which are a complete variance with the Bible itself. I'm very anxious that you should read out this passage from Samuel,
yes,
bearing in mind that of the kings of Judah and Israel, there were maybe 3 or 4 or 5 of whom it is said they did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. There was Asa and Jehoshaphat and King Joash. But even in the case of the best, there was always a qualification. David and Bathsheba. And of the others it said, nevertheless, or notwithstanding, they still kept up the idol worship. And the biggest warning of all, the biggest anti-monarchical statement is this passage that you're going to read.
Yes, it's one of my favorite passages out of the entire Bible. Samuel was the last and the greatest of the judges, surely. The people said unto him, now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice. Howbeit, yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, this will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands, and captains over 50s, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers, and so forth and so on. In other words, he begins to describe the potentate who will finally make them, in some sense, victims of his absolute power. What God is saying, I should say in substance, is this. You must listen to the people. They have asked you for this. You must give it to them if they want it, but I want you to tell them what it will mean. They have ceased. They have a king. I am their king. You are their judge. I am their king. They have ceased to believe in me as their king, and they want one of those little kings that ride about with gold headdresses in chariots.
Now, it's a fascinating problem. What is it that has enabled people to base what they call the divine right of kings on biblical text? Yeah. When you've got this, when you've got the record of the kings of Judah and of Israel, most of whom it is said, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Some of them more. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, was very bad, and Jeroboam the second was even worse. When they want Ahab, they always keep referring to the wickedness of the Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, and they have very little good to say of the majority of kings. Nevertheless, what somebody called the right divine of kings to govern wrong became part of the habitual outlook of countries, certainly of England in the time of the Stuarts, somewhat later too. You remember the famous Bishop of Bray and the Vicar of Bray, who taught the divine right of kings when necessary. And then again, you come in the Bible across phrases like, put not your trust in princes nor in the Son of Man. Yet, people are able to use the Bible, to quote the Bible, as the justification of the divine right of kings.
Well, they think they're able, although a close reading of it would not justify them at all. Of course, as we all know, they had very few good kings from this moment on. The first king, Saul, was a failure, substantially a failure. David, of course, was a great king. However, his son Solomon had serious defects.
Yes, of him it is...
and limitations, and
even of the beloved Solomon, it is said that in his latter days he did evil in the sight of the Lord, because he allowed himself, by his uxoriousness, to be led into idol worship, or into the condoning of idol worship, so that there was a very serious blemish on his character. After that, it was a grab bag of kings. The Israelites were very lucky when they got a good king, apparently from nowhere, a man like a Jehoshaphat or an Asa or a Joash, who was a marvelous figure in that time. Or they came across a Manasseh at the end, who was really an abominable figure, reigned for 60 years, introduced all of the vilest orgiastic practices of the surrounding cults into the temple itself. And this was the time when we're told that anonymous prophets came to the Israelites. They were not yet what we call the Jewish people. They were still the Israelites. This was Judea. And said, you have angered me. You have continued to anger me from the day that you came out of Egypt until this moment, and I will take Jerusalem and wipe it out as a man takes a dish and turns it upside down and wipes it out.
Yes.
Now, these were the kings, and yet the divine right of kings was for a long time.
Yes. Oh, I'm sure, Maurice, that point, as it were, makes itself. Now, but let me ask you a very tough question. Returning us to, if you please, to the matter that we discussed a few moments ago of the government as teacher. I mean, not the state as teacher, but the government as teacher, the wise men of the world as teachers of us all. I spoke of a hideous example in our time of a state, namely the Nazi state, which set about to condition its young men, and did so that they thought certain things, not because they were true, but because they were to the advantage of the state. We hear that the same thing is true in contemporary Russia, that generations of men and women, boys and girls, are taught in such a way that they become immediately useful and permanently useful.
They're conditioned to
the
that
state.
end.
Now here's where it gets tough. What are we going to do in our democracy, if we have one? And I cling to the belief that we have. What does it mean to say that we should educate our young people to be citizens of a democracy, that we shall educate our students, our children, our young people, so that they will be conditioned for democracy?
Yes, you're putting that in quotation marks.
I'm putting quotation marks,
yes.
and it's a terrible thing to have to do that. I'm always unhappy when talk about education, popular education, I say public education, takes that turn, as if we had to inculcate or promulgate some kind of doctrines about democracy, which I don't think democracy will bear.
Mark, I'm going to throw the question back at you. You've been a teacher at Columbia University for 40 years. Famous pupils of yours have praised you highly. And I say this quite objectively, it is so widely known. You're a famous teacher. Now, when you were teaching, did you have in mind only the objective material which you placed before your students? Was there never a conscious moral implication in what you were teaching?
Well, that's a very, very hard question to ask. I happen to believe, returning to that other point I was making, it's really relevant, I happen to believe that the best education in a democracy is the best education, period. You do not educate for democracy. You educate in the very best and deepest sense of that word. That is to say, you free the minds of your young people to think the best that can be thought, or whatever can be thought, perhaps. Perhaps you must have confidence that if they really think, they will think well.
I'm going to make a question more specific, Mark.
And so, well, all right, I'll come back to the personal thing. I have always been so sure of that. I've always been so sure that democracy is not a thing to indoctrinate, but a thing to live, that for a good many years I discovered from time to time that my students were a little unhappy because I never told them what I thought about things. I never endeavored to impose beliefs of mine upon them. And every now and then that would come to me. That would be said about me. I would hear it. Well, I was in trouble for a while. I must confess, I must say that in the second half of my 40 years of teaching, that was said less, because apparently I was declaring myself. I was making it clear what I did think about things. I'm not going to tell you what they are, what they were.
No.
It was partly through teaching the Bible, incidentally, partly through teaching Shakespeare, who certainly knew what he thought, even though he doesn't make statements.
I'm sure you knew what you thought before, but you relied too much upon the mere transmission of information.
That's right.
And you feel that you didn't let yourself impose the resultant of all your studies upon them. You wanted them to find it for themselves. Well, you were following, I should say, something like, although not to the same degree, something like what do they call it now, the project method or the child-directed school. Something of that was in your attitude during the first 20 years,
yes.
And you discovered that it didn't work.
That's right. In other words, I wanted them to think, and I didn't give them enough examples of my own thought. Not in the form of pronunciamentos or...
No, I wouldn't imagine you'd ever do that. There was in my mind the contrast...
But I let them see that I was thinking, too. That's what I wanted them finally to do.
That you had a view and an attitude.
That's right.
And you declared it.
Yes.
Without imposing it.
Perfectly willing to let them know what it was. They didn't have to share it.
Well, there is, in my mind, there rises the contrast between the classical type of yeshiva, the Talmudical college, and, let us say, the university in which men like you are at the front. In the yeshiva, there is a constant and conscious emphasis. You are getting a moral upbringing. Mm-hmm. In the university, you had to wait for a while to introduce it as a consequence of your discovery that its complete absence was detrimental.
Yes.
I don't know which of the two is completely correct, but certainly it appears there is something in the yeshiva attitude which is fundamental. You do not take young people and just let them choose at random.
That's right. And you want them to open their minds, but you also want them somehow or other to make discoveries.
Yes. What is the meaning of the wisdom of the ages when we pretend that we're not teaching the young? It merely means we're letting others teach them. And the fateful importance of this is going to appear when we discuss in our next week's program the problems of war and democracy.
You have just heard The Words We Live By, the 12th in the 15-week Eternal Light Summer Series. Be with us again next week when Maurice Samuel and Mark Van Doren will resume their discussion of democracy and the Bible. The Words We Live By is produced under the auspices of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. This pre-recorded program has been an NBC Public Affairs presentation.
This is the NBC Radio Network.